Hey guys! In this tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted this rainbow lorikeet using gouache step by step. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. Today I'm working on the Arches medium tooth watercolour paper from a really old pad that I have. It's 100% cotton and the texture feels quite rough. My preference is a smooth watercolour paper or a hot press paper, but I have two whole pads of this that I don't want to go to waste. I'm using the Winsor & Newton's designer gouache and a mixture of different brushes, most of them are the Neef ones. I've taped down my artwork just with some acid-free masking tape so my paper dries flat once I wet it. And since my last experiment with gouache, which was actually my first one, I learnt a little bit about how it works in comparison to watercolour, and so this time I'm going to try and do a more watercolour type background using the wet on wet technique. Whereas in my last gouache piece, I mainly did wet on dry techniques with the paint being a little thicker and looking a bit more like acrylics, so I wanted to see what this paint could do when you thin it down like a watercolour. I'm using masking fluid to block in the bird and some of the bottle brush plant so it's easier to get a nice even wash over the background without having to paint around the bird. I'm using Art Spectrum colourless masking fluid and it's the first time I'm using this one. I'm not actually sure if I like it, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I've squeezed out some of the blues and teals from the tubes and I'm just mixing up a few colours for the sky area before I wet my paper. Because if I wet the surface and then mix my colours, my paper will start to dry while I'm wasting time mixing colours. I'm wetting my paper in a nice even layer and I don't want to get it so wet that you can see puddles or pools of water, I just want it damp enough so that it glistens. And I'm making sure to continue doing strokes back and forth over the entire area until it's a nice smooth even coverage. And then I'm going in with some of those blues, just mixing up the teals, the light blues and the dark blues to give it some variation. The wet in wet technique allows your paints to blend nicely together, so it will be a nice gradient. Then I'm using the splatter technique while the paper is still wet to add in some of those darker blues and pinks and greens into the background. And I love the effect that this technique gives. It blends nicely if you add it into a wet area so the edges aren't too harsh. And sometimes I also do this on dry paper so that the splatters have more of a harsher edge for a bit of variation. So I'm basically loading up the brush and then tapping it so drips fall off, and you can get different size splatters by using different size brushes. Then I'm adding in table salt in some areas because it creates a nice sort of effect once it dries. I think it gives some interest to the expressive pieces. So I've let that dry and it's now time to remove the masking fluid, and this is where I had some issues. I'm not sure if it was user error or that it just doesn't work as well as other masking fluids I've used, but it was very hard to remove. Maybe I didn't put it on thick enough, or maybe it doesn't go well with this type of paper, I don't really know, but I didn't leave it on for longer than it needed to be, so it shouldn't have had any issues. Usually I can peel it off with my fingers alone, but I had a really hard time with this and I had to really rub with this gum eraser for it to come off. And I didn't really want to rub that hard because I didn't want to damage the paper. So maybe I'll have to get a different masking fluid for future projects. But in hindsight, I probably didn't really need it because gouache can be used as an opaque medium, so technically I could have painted the bird over the top of the background. But I thought it would be easier this way and I wanted the colours in the bird to be as vibrant as possible, which is easier to achieve if the paper is white rather than trying to go on top of a previous layer of paint. I'm blocking in the flowers, which are some pink bottle brush, so I wet the area first and I'm just using some red that's really watered down to create a more pink colour, and then I'm using a bit more red in the centre to create some depth. I also added a little bit of dark blue in the centre, which creates sort of a purple colour when it mixes with the reds, and I'm doing some of those splatters again with some white gouache just to keep that expressive look throughout the piece. I started doing the bottom flower and then realised it wasn't being recorded inside of the frame, but I did the same thing on that one, but this time I used some of the greens on the end where the flower hasn't quite opened up all the way yet, so some of that stick is still showing through. And there's also another flower that hasn't opened up at all behind it, so I've gone in with some greens in that area as well. The reference photo that I'm using has this big blue section on the bottom right, and it kind of looks a little out of place because the way that the bird is sitting, it looked like it was cut off down the middle. So I decided to fill in that area with more flowers instead, So I'm just blocking in some colours in that area that I will add to once it's dry. And I'm also adding in some more of that salt again to this layer to make some more interesting effects. So moving on to the beak, I'm just blocking in the main orange colour because I'll come back through with some other reds and yellows once this layer is dry. And I'm also filling in the grey area on his nose and around his eyes. I'm really just blocking in the base colours at this point with quite a diluted mix of gouache, so it's almost like watercolour. It's quite transparent, but I'll be adding more opaque layers on top in the later layers. With my expressive pieces, I'm not too worried about the colours being correct or having all the details there. I just want to make sure that you can tell what animal it is and have a bit more fun with it. And I use watercolour and gouache as mediums where I can have a bit more of a loose style because most of my work is pretty realistic when I work in coloured pencil and pastel or any other medium really. So when I use the gouache and watercolour, I like to let the paint do what it wants and then work around it rather than trying to be perfect with every stroke and every detail. When you work with watercolour or gouache, if there's an area that is wet and you go in with the paint into an area next to it, it will bleed into that wet area as well. So I've left some parts like the stomach and around the eye area to do once this layer dries. And now that I've let the piece dry, I'm going to go in with a second layer on these bottle brush flowers. I'm just building up that contrast with some different reds and pinks and just roughly blocking in parts of the stem as well. I'll also be adding another flower over the top of the body of the bird, but I wanted to wait until everything is dry before I add the flower on top. And that's the good thing about gouache is that you don't have to worry about working from light to dark like you do with watercolour. You can just go straight over the top with more opaque mixes where they're less watered down and it will go on top pretty well. So I've let the previous layer dry and I'm going to go in with the yellows on his chest. And this is the reason why I wanted to keep the bird white using the masking fluid when I was doing the background, because yellows, oranges and reds are usually more transparent than other colours, which means that you can see through them to the colours underneath. So in order to make the yellow actually look yellow, it needs to be white underneath. And while this area is still wet, I'm adding in the oranges and the reds on top so that it blends in a little bit. Then I'm also going over the beak with a more opaque orange because the previous layer bled into the beak area, so it got a bit dirty looking. And this way I can go over the top of that once it dries with some reds and yellows again. I'm also adding a bit of a brighter blue to the head. Although I'm not too worried about the details, I still want to follow the direction of the feathers. The green part of the body is dry now, so I'm going to go in with some darker greens to create some more texture, overlapping the yellow and red areas of the body so it bleeds into those colours a little bit. And then I'm going to go back over the head area and add some variation to the blues to create a bit more texture. And then I'm adding in some more layers on those flowers just with some whites and light pinks, just to create a little more detail in those areas. And while I've been working on the head and the flowers, the body part of the lorikeet is fairly dry, so I'm going to go over the top with an opaque mixture of greens and reds to add that flower over the top. Before I do that, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then head over and check out my Patreon channel. For as little as $4 per month, you will have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so that you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. When you want an area to be more opaque or you just need to go over the top of something, if your colours are a bit see-through, you can just add some white to your mixture and it will make it more opaque. If you want to add a really vivid colour like yellow on top, you want to do that area white first and then wait for it to dry and then add yellow there. Because when you mix white in with things, it creates more of a milky colour. So to avoid that, you can paint the area white and then let it dry and then go back in with your desired colour. So I'm just drying that flower with a hairdryer to speed up the drying process. And make sure that if you're going to do this, to put your hairdryer on the lowest setting and make sure that your paper is not hot or warm when you go back in with your paints, because it'll dry a lot quicker that way. So I'm just building up that texture on the bottle brush, adding in more whites and pinks and reds until I get the desired look that I'm after. And I'm also adding in some of those splatters as well. Going back in with a finer brush, I'm adding in a bit more detail into the flower that's in the front. Then I'll come back through with a thicker brush to blend it out a little bit so that it's a bit more fluffy looking towards the center. I'm adding in some more texture on his head because the feathers in this area are quite prominent, and I'll go back over and glaze them a little bit darker once it's dry. And I'm just going through and adding in any details or colors in areas that I think needs a bit more contrast or variation in color, like in the center of the bottle brush and around the eyes. And then I'm coming back through with a darker blue to go over some of that texture on his head and soften it out a little bit. I want to make sure that I don't add white to this mixture because I want the paint to be a bit see-through so that I don't cover all of the brush strokes and texture that I put in. I still want to see some of that texture through this layer. I'm also adding a little more texture around his neck area so that the amount of detail looks cohesive to his head. There's a playlist on the screen with some other watercolour and gouache tutorials that I think you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.